On October 29, 2018, at 6:20 in the morning, a Boeing 737 MAX took off from Jakarta's Soekarno-Hatta Airport with 189 people on board. 12 minutes later, it plunged into the Java Sea, killing everyone instantly. 4 months later, another 737 MAX, this time an Ethiopian Airlines flight, crashed just 6 minutes after takeoff, killing another 157. But today's episode isn't just about Boeing's mechanical failures. That story has been well told. Today's story is about how fear transformed Boeing from the world's most admired engineering culture that helped invent the modern aviation industry into a company that, as one former Boeing engineer testified, became a place more focused on the stock price than on building safe airplanes. It's also a story about how courage is helping Boeing rediscover the soul of the company. Hey everyone, I'm Terrace Wayner, and welcome to another episode of A Case Study in Corporate Fear, where I do the forensics to better understand how and why fear transforms brave leaders of thriving companies into spineless failures of corporate catastrophes, all so you never make the same mistakes. And while most know the names of epic fails like Blockbuster, Tower Records, Sony, and Kodak, what most don't know is that the true mastermind behind their collapse was fear. Today's case study analyzes Boeing, and it's the most tragic one I've done so far because this isn't about a company whose fear-driven decisions merely drove it into bankruptcy. This is about how those decisions contributed to the deaths of 346 innocent people. And according to just about every investigation, it was completely avoidable. But to better understand how far Boeing veered off course, you need to meet the man who taught them how to fly. His name is William McPherson Allen, and in 1952, he was Boeing's president. At the time, Boeing was a middling aircraft manufacturer with a small share of the commercial airline market that was dominated by Douglas aircraft. Douglas's DC-6 was considered the pinnacle of piston engine technology. But even the best airplanes of the time flew at only 300 miles per hour and had to stay at lower altitudes. Together, this created tremendous turbulence and a very bumpy ride. For example, the Douglas DC-6 took about 10 hours to fly from New York to Los Angeles and had to stop along the way to refuel. But then Allen took a flight on one of Boeing's new B-47 bomber they had recently designed for the military. It cruised in the stratosphere at 35,000 feet and reached speeds of 600 miles per hour. This made for a much smoother flight and cut cross-country flight time in half. Allen felt it was a heavenly experience compared to the slow, teeth-chattering DC-6 prop plane, and he returned to Boeing's home office in Seattle with a vision. Jet flight would be the future of commercial aviation, and Boeing would lead the way. But Allen had no customers or orders, plus competitors like Douglas and Lockheed had already looked at the development costs and shelved any serious consideration of passenger jets because the ticket cost would be astronomical. Undeterred, he announced that Boeing's order book was open for their new jet called the 707. Next, Allen did something that today's corporate executives would consider insane. He bet the company on the new passenger jet, literally. He authorized $16 million to build one prototype airplane, a sum that drained 25% of Boeing's net worth and left the company in a precarious financial position. Allen later said, "We felt strongly that it was high time some American manufacturers took the plunge and got jet transport off of paper and into the air." The 707 didn't just succeed, it revolutionized air travel. And Allen was just getting started. In 1965, Allen met with Juan Trippe, the visionary boss of Pan Am. Trippe had an impossible ask. He wanted an aircraft that could carry 400 passengers across oceans, something so large it defied imagination. Allen replied to the challenge by looking Trippe sternly in the eye and saying, "If you buy it, I will build it." To which Trippe famously told Allen, "If you build it, I will buy it." The two men shook hands and the famous 747 was born. It was a project so audacious that Boeing had to build the world's largest factory just to assemble it. The Everett factory that housed the construction of the 747 was 398,000 square meters and had the capacity to hold 75 football fields. As the 747's chief engineer Joe Sutter later reflected, people who study aviation would have determined the 747 wasn't worth the effort. It was the kind of crazy idea that required the foresight of two visionary leaders. But Sutter knew in his heart they could build it because the Boeing culture consisted of two important things: leaders willing to take enormous risks on revolutionary technology and excellent engineers. And Boeing had a deep bench of both. Under Allen's leadership, Boeing created the 707, the 727, the 737, and the 747. But it was the 777 program that came next that represented the pinnacle of Boeing's engineering expertise. And it would become the first commercial aircraft developed and built with unprecedented collaboration between 8 major airlines. Alan Mulally, who served as the 777 Director of Engineering before becoming program leader, pioneered what Boeing called the Working Together Group. Nippon Airways, Qantas, British Airways, Cathay Pacific, as well as Delta, Japan, American, and United Airlines all played an active role in the design process. This was revolutionary because in the past, manufacturers had typically designed aircrafts with minimal to no airline input. But Mulally's approach was different. At the group's first meeting, a 23-page questionnaire was distributed to the airlines asking what each company wanted in the design. And just 3 months later, the group had decided on a baseline configuration, a cabin design with capacity for up to 325 passengers, a flexible interior, and a cockpit with direct input from pilots. Dozens of design teams addressed over 1,500 issues covering individual aircraft components. The 777 became Boeing's best-selling wide-body airliner with thousands of orders. And Aviation Week called the aircraft the most successful wide-body program in commercial aviation history. At the core of its design philosophy was an emphasis on safety by way of redundancy. Following Joe Sutter's principles, the aircraft featured multiple backup systems for every critical function. Sutter describes it this way: airplanes are designed with the philosophy that everything won't be great all the time. That's why our planes have 4 flight control systems, 4 hydraulic systems, and 4 sets of landing gears. This was Boeing at its peak, and the 777 program represented everything the company stood for: technical excellence, collaborative innovation, and an unwavering commitment to building the best possible aircraft and building them better than anyone else. And it was driven by Allen's simple philosophy: take big risks on revolutionary technology and always prioritize engineering. And this philosophy continued until December 15th, 1996. That was the day Boeing announced it would acquire McDonnell Douglas for $13.3 billion. The idea for the acquisition was hatched at a dinner of the top defense contractors hosted by the Pentagon. The infamous gathering has come to be known as the Last Supper. At the dinner, the Defense Secretary Les Aspin told the airline leaders that the Cold War was over and there's not enough money to go around, that there are too many companies chasing dwindling defense dollars, and you need to consolidate or die. Boeing had been primarily focused on commercial aviation. But with growing competition from companies like Airbus, margins were under pressure, and since defense contracts were more stable, Boeing wanted in. The problem was Boeing hadn't built a fighter jet since before World War II. McDonnell Douglas suddenly looked very attractive since they had $6 billion in defense contracts and brought extensive fighter jet expertise. And while it looked like a triumph on paper, the truth was McDonnell Douglas was near collapse. Leading the merger was Boeing CEO Phil Condit. Condit had joined Boeing in 1965 as an engineer and became a program manager on the successful 777 project in the 1980s, making him one of Boeing's golden boys. And when he was made CEO in 1996, it seemed like the perfect choice. But even though he was an engineer, Condit would become remembered as the architect of Boeing's transformation from an engineering company to a finance focused corporation. He sold the idea of buying the struggling McDonnell Douglas to the board as a way to diversify Boeing beyond commercial aviation and create a total aerospace company that balanced commercial and defense revenues. But Condit essentially paid $14 billion to acquire a failing competitor's defense assets. And he severely underestimated the cultural impact of bringing in McDonnell Douglas executives who would wind up dominating the new company. In the process of acquiring a failing competitor's defense assets, Boeing unknowingly acquired their failing business philosophy too. Critical changes he allowed to happen was the replacing of many of the engineers in Boeing's top roles with business executives from McDonnell Douglas. At the end of the day, the company with the stronger commercial aviation position and better culture allowed itself to be culturally conquered by the company they were essentially rescuing from potential bankruptcy. The criticism of Condit is scathing. As one aviation historian said, if you had to pick one person most responsible for Boeing's fall from grace, it would be Phil Condit. Not because he was the worst leader, but because he was the one who had the credibility and knowledge to save Boeing's culture and chose to destroy it instead. But Condit wasn't evil or incompetent. He was someone I believe was worse. He was a Boeing engineer who forgot what made Boeing great in the first place. The clash between the two companies was immediate and devastating as Boeing's engineering-focused culture collided with McDonnell Douglas's finance-oriented approach. According to internal Boeing documents, after the merger, engineering input in major business decisions dropped significantly, and financial metrics began replacing engineering excellence as the primary measure of success. Projects were increasingly evaluated based on short-term return on investment rather than long-term technological advancement, and research projects that had been the company's lifeblood were systematically defunded if they couldn't demonstrate immediate profitability. But then came a decision from Condit that further drove a wedge between executives and engineers. In September 2001, Boeing relocated its corporate headquarters to Chicago while leaving the engineering staff in Seattle, putting a 2,000-mile gap between decision makers and aircraft builders. This level of geographic separation between corporate headquarters and core engineering functions was extremely unusual in the aerospace industry. Complex aircraft development requires constant communication between executive and technical teams. But the newly minted Boeing execs wanted to be closer to Wall Street and other financial centers in order to be seen as a modern corporation rather than just an engineering company. Then in 2003, the reshaping of Boeing's DNA would continue when Harry Stonecipher came in as the new CEO. Stonecipher had this to say about his personal impact on Boeing. When people say I changed the culture of Boeing, that was my intent. I wanted it to run like a modern business rather than an engineering firm. One of Stonecipher's most fateful decisions perfectly captured this new philosophy. When Boeing's head of commercial aviation proposed designing an all-new single-aisle aircraft to replace the aging 727, 737, and 757, Stonecipher turned him down. According to reports from the time, instead of designing a new airplane incorporating decades of aviation advances, Stonecipher elected to maximize profits from older models and use a portion of the cash to buy back Boeing stock. But Stonecipher was forced to resign following a personal conduct violation. Stonecipher, who was married, was having an affair with another Boeing executive. The irony was that he had just completed putting stricter ethical standards and conduct policies into place. To many, this was a blessing in disguise since Boeing had the perfect internal candidate waiting in the wings to replace Stonecipher and return the company to its engineering roots. His name was Alan Mulally. He headed commercial aviation and, as I mentioned earlier, led the development of the highly successful 777. Mullally joined Boeing after getting his degree in aeronautical engineering and worked his way up through various roles and was known for his collaborative leadership style and engineering excellence. But rather than promoting Mullally, the board recruited and hired ex-GE executive Jim McNerney. And McNerney became Boeing's first CEO with neither aircraft engineering or aviation industry experience. After being passed over, Mullally left Boeing and became CEO of Ford, where he led one of the most important business turnarounds in automotive history. Mullally is one of Boeing's most fascinating what-if stories. Not promoting him to CEO represents one of those turning points in the company where they could have righted the ship. But after the Stone Cipher scandal, Boeing felt they needed to rebuild their reputation with the government, and someone with business management skills looked more important than someone with aviation expertise. This succession not only represented a lost opportunity, it also contributed to Boeing's continued cultural drift away from its engineering roots. A former Boeing executive captured the new philosophy perfectly when she said, "The goal was not to get overly focused on the box," meaning the airplane. To engineers, the box is everything, but the box is merely a means to an end for corporate executives. Boeing had been completely transformed. The company that Bill Allen had built with bold ideas and revolutionary engineering was now being led by those whose biggest worries were the things that might hurt quarterly earnings. At first, this style of leading showed it could solve big problems. One issue McNerney inherited was the 787 Dreamliner crisis. The 787 Dreamliner was presented by Boeing executives as a revolutionary aircraft. It was 20% more fuel efficient, and 50% of its parts were outsourced to reduce costs. The wings and forward fuselage came from Mitsubishi and Kawasaki in Japan. The center fuselage and horizontal stabilizer were built in Italy, and the landing gear doors were built in Sweden, with final assembly happening at Boeing's plant in Washington. But many of the suppliers couldn't meet Boeing's specifications, leading to quality control problems. There were also communication barriers across time zones and languages, and some of the parts simply didn't fit together. Wing body joints failed stress tests, flight control systems couldn't integrate properly, and there was an incorrect installation of thousands of fasteners. This led to the delivery of the Dreamliner to be delayed by over 3 years and massive cost overruns. Then, when it was finally in the air, there were lithium-ion battery fires on 2 of the planes. The FAA grounded the entire fleet worldwide immediately. But McNerney successfully navigated the crisis with savvy financial management. Boeing spent millions to compensate airlines for delays, which helped them maintain their orders despite the fires. They eventually delivered an aircraft that airlines loved, and the Boeing stock price recovered nicely. And McNerney was credited with and highly praised for successfully navigating the 787 crisis. But while Boeing was learning that financial engineering can overcome technical problems and that a stock price recovery validates an approach, perhaps what Boeing should have learned was to not outsource critical systems and to not let financial pressure drive engineering decisions. As one industry observer noted, McNerney saved the 787, but the way he did it convinced Boeing leadership that financial engineering could solve any problem. And this validation of a successful financial-first approach set the stage for what was to come next, the 737 MAX. In 2010, Airbus had just announced their A320neo. The new plane was more aerodynamic, promised better fuel efficiency, and would be ready for delivery in just 5 years. Airlines were lining up to place their orders, and McNerney was suddenly faced with another career-defining decision. He could go the path of Bill Allen, the leader who put Boeing on the map, and compete with Airbus by building a brand new aircraft from scratch with transformational technology that showed off the company's engineering excellence. Or he could upgrade the 737 and call it the 737 MAX. McNerney's decision was driven by three major concerns. First was time. Boeing was under intense competitive pressure to keep pace with Airbus, and McNerney believed to do so, it needed a quick solution. Second was cost. Designing a new aircraft from scratch would cost 15 to 20 billion and take a decade to develop. This could lead to Wall Street punishing Boeing's stock price. An upgrade would only take 5 years and cost substantially less. And third was training. An upgrade meant that pilots would be able to fly the 737 MAX with minimal additional training. As we all know, McNerney went with the upgrade. The design of the 737 MAX had a fundamental problem that Boeing's engineering teams noticed immediately. One of the upgrades were new, larger engines, and this meant the engines couldn't fit in the same position on the wings as the old ones. So Boeing had to mount them higher and further forward on the wing, which changed the aircraft's aerodynamics and could cause the nose to pitch up unexpectedly during certain flight conditions. But like I mentioned earlier, airplanes are designed to catch these problems with the help from redundant systems. Like how the 747 has 4 flight control systems and 4 hydraulic systems. But under McNerney, it seemed like Boeing was on a mission to do away with complexity. For example, instead of multiple redundant systems, Boeing designed the MCAS, short for the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, to rely on data from a single sensor. But aviation experts who later analyzed the system found that it had multiple design flaws beyond the single sensor issue. One was that the new system could activate repeatedly, pushing the nose down multiple times if pilots tried to manually correct the aircraft's altitude. This created a scenario where pilots could be fighting the aircraft's computer systems without knowing why. And Boeing allegedly had extensive data showing that pilots might not be able to respond appropriately to MCAS malfunctions. The entire 737 MAX development process showed just how massive the disconnect had grown between the engineers on the ground and the executives in the boardroom. This was the same company that had invented and embraced a collaborative model while designing the 777. Next, as part of a Boeing's planned succession, Dennis Muhlenberg replaced Jim McNerney as CEO. Many congratulated McNerney for leaving Boeing in great financial shape. The defense business was strong, and the 737 MAX was about to enter service. Muhlenberg was handpicked by McNerney and fully embraced the culture of financial engineering. Looking back and knowing what was to come, this was yet another moment Boeing could have and should have pivoted and brought in a CEO who could lead the company back to its engineering roots. But even the top aviation experts agree it would have been impossible. By 2015, Boeing had been finance-focused for over 12 years, and the board had systematically chosen business leaders over engineers since 1997. And the run like a business rather than an engineering firm philosophy was well entrenched. As one industry observer noted, asking Boeing to choose an engineer-led CEO at this time would have been like asking them to reject everything they believed was making the company successful. As Muhlenberg settled in, the company was completely focused on the redesign and certification process of the 737 MAX, and the financial pressures were only intensifying throughout the development and building processes. The aircraft's design compromises were already locked in, and the commitment to no additional pilot training was already made. And those building the planes were under tremendous pressure to meet deadlines. Reports state that Muhlenberg's team established countdown clocks tied to major production milestones, one counting down to the deadline for powering on the first airplane in the factory and another to the plane's scheduled first test flight. A former employee who testified before Congress said Boeing had created a culture where questioning the timeline was career suicide. During this time, engineers knew that the MCAS reliance on data from a single sensor was a recipe for disaster, but they were too scared to speak up out of fear of retaliation. And, according to reports, Boeing also knew pilots weren't being told about it. Then the unthinkable happened. Lion Air Flight 610, a Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, plunged into the Java Sea, killing all 189 passengers and crew aboard. After the crash, Boeing issued a statement saying that the 737 MAX is as safe as any airplane that has ever flown the skies. 4 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, also a Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, crashed, killing all 157 aboard. But even after the second crash, Muhlenberg continued defending the safety of the aircraft. And the Department of Justice uncovered that Muhlenberg made misleading statements in earnings calls that gave the impression that there were no safety issues with the plane. When global aviation authorities began grounding the MAX, Muhlenberg had a phone conversation with President Trump in which he told the president that Boeing's position is that the MAX aircraft is safe. Outside the U.S., authorities immediately grounded the plane over safety concerns. And when Boeing leadership failed to voluntarily ground its entire fleet of the planes in the States, the FAA did it for them. The FAA forced Boeing into a lengthy set of regulatory inspections, tests, and design changes that lasted 20 months. Boeing eventually paid $20 billion in fines and compensation. They also paid over $2.5 billion in criminal penalties, with much of it going to a crash victim beneficiary fund. As for Muhlenberg, he was fined $1 million for making materially misleading public statements. The first thing Boeing did to help rebuild trust with the public and the airlines was to increase pilot training on the MCAS, as well as build 3 layers of redundancies into the plane's software. But it was too late for Muhlenberg, and in 2019, he was fired. And while he did not receive a severance package, Muhlenberg still did all right. Over his years at Boeing, he was paid over $80 million. To which one lawmaker noted, "Call it whatever you want. Severance, compensation, contractual benefits." Dennis Muhlenberg walked away with $80 million after 346 people died on his watch. The families don't care what Boeing calls it. Unfortunately, this story doesn't end with the 737 MAX crashes and Muhlenberg's termination. In 2020, Dave Calhoun was brought in as CEO to clean things up. Calhoun wasn't new to Boeing. He had been a board member since 2009. The very same board that approved the 737 MAX program, supported the no additional pilot training of the MCAS system, and championed spending billions in stock buybacks. Then on January 5th, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 suffered a mid-flight blowout of a plug filling an unused emergency exit, causing rapid decompression. The cause was determined to be missing bolts on the door plug installation. According to investigations, the door plug that ripped off only existed because of cost-cutting production techniques to facilitate fitting more passengers into the cabin. Calhoun initially downplayed the severity of the door plug incident, but all of the aircrafts were immediately grounded. And during inspections, Alaska Airlines found loose bolts on multiple Boeing aircraft door plugs. The investigations also uncovered systematic quality control problems across Boeing facilities, falsified inspection records, and skipped mandatory wing inspections since 2020. And under Calhoun's watch as CEO, 32 whistleblower complaints were filed. On June 2024, Calhoun faced bipartisan congressional grilling over the Alaska Airlines incident, where lawmakers accused him of continued prioritization of profits over safety. At the hearing, families of 737 MAX crash victims confronted him directly. But his response was seen by many as evasive and cold, to which one of the representatives said, "Mr. Calhoun, you were on the board when these decisions were made. You can't just blame your predecessor when you were part of the problem." Another representative added, "Mr. Calhoun, you had 4 years to fix Boeing's culture, and instead we got more of the same. Corners cut, safety compromised, and profits prioritized. The Alaska Airlines incident proves that nothing has really changed." Calhoun announced his resignation that same year. His exit compensation was around $24 million, and this was after being paid $32 million in 2023, the highest ever for a Boeing CEO. Replacing Calhoun and as Boeing's current CEO is Kelly Ortberg. And when Ortberg was announced, you could probably hear the cheering coming from the engineers in Seattle all the way in Boeing's corporate offices in Chicago. This is because Ortberg has over 35 years of experience in the aerospace industry, representing a return to Boeing's engineering-focused roots. In fact, he's their first CEO with a strong engineering background since the McDonnell Douglas merger era and represents exactly what aviation experts said Boeing needed. To show he means business, Ortberg moved his office to Seattle, eliminating the separation between the CEO and engineers and making him the first CEO in decades to be based with his engineering team. His early actions include increased engineering oversight in manufacturing, stricter quality control measures, enhanced transparency with aviation regulators, and management restructuring to improve decision-making. Ortberg's appointment suggests Boeing has finally learned its lesson and sends a clear message that in aerospace, engineering excellence cannot be subordinate to financial engineering. And after his first year, the stock is up 35% year to date, showing that Boeing can operate as an engineering-led company and still make money. At its heart, Boeing's decline was driven by three interconnected fears: the fear of falling behind competitors like Airbus, the fear of disappointing Wall Street with long-term investments over short-term returns, and the fear of losing market share by investing the time and resources needed to build revolutionary aircrafts. And these fears pushed Boeing to abandon the very identity that had made it great, to choosing quick fixes over bold innovation and valuing quarterly earnings over the safety redundancies that had once defined Boeing's legacy. Kelly Ortberg's appointment shows that Boeing is bravely choosing the path of engineering excellence over the McDonnell Douglas financial engineering, and over Dennis Muhlenberg's countdown clocks, and especially over Harry Stonecipher's run like a business rather than a great engineering firm. The question isn't whether Boeing can return to consistent profitability, it's whether Boeing can return to its soul. Because according to Boeing's own history, when you get the engineering right, when you build safety into every bolt and redundancy into every system, when you listen to engineers instead of spreadsheets, the profits will always follow. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What shortcuts are you taking in your company because you're afraid of the investment? What's your version of moving headquarters away from the people who actually build your product? And most importantly, are you making decisions based on what made your company great in the first place, or based on fear of what Wall Street, your competitors, or your shareholders might think? Boeing's tragedy teaches us that the stakes of fear-driven leadership aren't always measured in stock prices or market share. Sometimes the cost is measured in human lives. And while your company's decisions may not carry that same weight, the pattern is universal. When fear replaces courage, when financial engineering replaces actual engineering, you lose what made you great in the first place. Thank you for joining me for another episode of A Case Study in Corporate Fear. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more case studies and to further understand the impact fear can have on your company, visit fear-incorporated.com. You will also find the sources and citations used to fact-check this episode.